They don't need to hide the truth forever. They just need you to look away long enough. Because power doesn't collapse when secrets exist. It survives when attention moves on. The moment people stop asking, pressure disappears. And the most dangerous distraction isn't noise. It's the feeling that the story is already over when the questions were never answered. Silence is often presented as neutral, even responsible. We are told that staying quiet avoids chaos, protects stability, and preserves order. But silence is rarely neutral. It usually has a direction, and that direction almost always favors those who already hold influence. When information is withheld, it is not withheld equally. It does not land evenly across society. It concentrates protection upward, not outward. Secrecy creates a buffer around institutions, reputations, and networks, while leaving individuals to absorb the consequences without context, without answers, and without recourse. Systems rely on silence because systems are built to survive. They are designed to maintain continuity, legitimacy, and public trust, even when that trust is fragile. When uncomfortable truths threaten that stability, silence becomes a tool, not an accident, a tool. It shows up as delayed disclosures, restricted access, sealed documents, and vague explanations framed as for the greater good. The language sounds reasonable. The impact is not. The longer silence is maintained, the more it shields procedures, hierarchies, and decision makers from scrutiny, while the people affected are left navigating confusion and doubt. People assume secrecy exists to prevent harm. In reality, secrecy often prevents accountability. Harm doesn't disappear just because it isn't named. It doesn't lessen because it's postponed. It simply becomes harder to trace. When silence dominates a situation, those without power are forced to fill the gaps themselves. They speculate. They mistrust. They question their own perceptions. Meanwhile, the system benefits from the ambiguity. Uncertainty protects structure better than clarity ever could. Silence also shifts the burden of proof. When information is hidden, individuals must work harder to be believed. They must explain themselves repeatedly while the system explains nothing. This imbalance exhausts people. Over time, exhaustion looks like acceptance. That is how silence sustains itself, not through force, but through fatigue. People stop asking because asking feels pointless. The system interprets that quiet not as unresolved tension, but as resolution. Secrecy gives the illusion of control. It suggests that by limiting what is known, outcomes can be managed. But what is actually being controlled is narrative, not reality. Events still occur. Decisions are still made. Consequences still unfold. The only thing missing is visibility. And when visibility is removed, responsibility becomes flexible. Accountability becomes negotiable. The system remains intact while individuals absorb the uncertainty. Another function of silence is fragmentation. When people don't have shared information, they can't form shared understanding. Without shared understanding, collective response weakens. Everyone operates on partial truths. This isolates individuals from one another while keeping the system unified. It's easier to manage scattered questions than a focused demand for clarity. Silence doesn't just hide facts, it prevents alignment. Secrecy also protects reputations more than realities. Institutions often frame silence as a way to avoid damage. What they mean is reputational damage. The assumption is that disclosure causes harm, while silence preserves trust. In practice, the opposite occurs. Trust erodes when people sense omission. They may not know what is missing, but they know something is. That awareness creates distance. Distance turns into skepticism. Skepticism eventually becomes disengagement. For individuals, silence is costly. It removes agency. When people lack information, they can't make informed decisions. They can't evaluate risk. They can't advocate effectively. They become dependent on official statements that may be incomplete by design. This dependency reinforces hierarchy. Those who control information control interpretation. Those who control interpretation shape outcomes. Systems defend silence by invoking complexity. They argue that the public wouldn't understand, that details would be misused, that transparency would cause confusion. Complexity becomes a justification for exclusion. But complexity doesn't require secrecy. It requires explanation. Choosing silence over explanation reveals priorities. It signals that maintaining control is more important than fostering understanding. Silence also distorts time. Delays create distance between cause and consequence. As time passes, urgency fades. Attention shifts. New events replace old questions. The system benefits from this natural erosion of focus. People move on not because answers were given, but because energy is finite. Silence waits people out. What's rarely acknowledged is that silence trains behavior. When people see that questions lead nowhere, they stop asking. When they see that transparency is resisted, they lower expectations. Over time, this becomes cultural. Silence stops feeling imposed and starts feeling normal. That is when systems become most protected, not because they are trusted, but because they are no longer challenged. Secrecy also reframes responsibility. Instead of systems being accountable to people, people are asked to be patient with systems. Patience becomes a virtue. Urgency is framed as recklessness. Demand for clarity is labeled disruptive. This moral inversion keeps power dynamics intact while appearing reasonable. The most dangerous aspect of silence is that it disconnects truth from consequence. When actions are hidden, learning stops, correction stops, improvement stops. The system survives, but it does not evolve. People pay the price for that stagnation, not immediately, but gradually through diminished trust, weakened institutions, and normalized doubt. Silence protects systems because systems can endure opacity. People cannot. Individuals need clarity to heal, to decide, to trust. When silence is prioritized, it is not a neutral choice. It is a decision about who is protected and who is exposed. And that decision, repeated over time, shapes not just outcomes, but expectations, behavior, and the very definition of accountability. Power does not fear noise as much as it fears clarity. Outrage can be managed, dismissed, or redirected. Transparency cannot. When information becomes visible, behavior changes, not because people suddenly become better, but because exposure removes the comfort of operating unseen. Power resists transparency for this reason. It limits flexibility. It narrows options. It turns private decisions into public consequences. Those who hold influence often frame transparency as a threat to order. They warn of instability, panic, or misuse of information. But what they are really responding to is loss of control. Transparency redistributes awareness. It allows others to see patterns, ask sharper questions, and connect dots that were never meant to be connected. Once that happens, power must justify itself. Instead of assuming compliance, exposure changes incentives. When actions are hidden, the primary motivation is preservation of position. When actions are visible, the motivation shifts toward defensibility. Decisions are made differently when they must be explained. Language becomes more careful. Processes become more deliberate. This is not moral transformation, it is behavioral adaptation. Transparency doesn't create virtue. It creates accountability. Pressure power structures prefer ambiguity because ambiguity allows selective response. If information is unclear, responsibility can be diffused. Mistakes can be reframed. Delays can be excused. Transparency removes that buffer. It fixes timelines. It clarifies roles. It makes it harder to pretend that no one knew, no one decided, or no one benefited. Resistance to transparency often shows up as procedural concern. Requests for information are slowed by process. Disclosures are partial. Context is withheld. This creates the appearance of openness while maintaining opacity. It is transparency in form, secrecy in function. Enough is revealed to claim cooperation, but not enough to invite real evaluation. When exposure occurs, power reacts predictably. First comes minimization. The issue is framed as isolated, misunderstood, or exaggerated. Then comes deflection. Attention is redirected to technicalities, legal boundaries, or unrelated achievements. Finally, fatigue is relied upon. The expectation is that sustained attention will fade, allowing normal operations to resume. Transparency disrupts this cycle by sustaining focus. What power understands instinctively is that visibility invites participation. Once information is public, interpretation is no longer centralized. People draw conclusions independently. Narratives multiply. Control over meaning weakens. This is uncomfortable for any hierarchy built on managed perception. Transparency replaces vertical communication with horizontal discussion. Exposure also changes who gets to ask questions. Without transparency, inquiry is limited to insiders. With transparency, outsiders gain footing. Journalists, researchers, and the public can engage with substance rather than speculation. This expands the circle of accountability. Power resists this expansion because it dilutes authority. There is also a psychological dimension. Operating without oversight creates distance from consequence. Over time, that distance becomes normalization. Actions that would feel questionable in daylight feel routine in the dark. Transparency collapses that distance. It forces alignment between private action and public standards. Not everyone is willing to make that adjustment. Power often claims that transparency undermines trust. The reality is that secrecy does. Trust is not built by withholding information. It is built by consistency between what is said and what is done. When transparency reveals gaps, those gaps already existed. Exposure does not create the problem. It reveals it. Behavior changes under scrutiny because scrutiny introduces memory. Actions are recorded. Statements can be revisited. Promises can be compared to outcomes. This continuity prevents revisionist narratives. Power resists transparency because it limits the ability to rewrite the past. Transparency also alters internal dynamics. When leadership knows that decisions may become visible, internal dissent becomes more valuable. Risk assessments become more honest. Documentation improves. This threatens informal power channels that rely on discretion and silence. Exposure formalizes what was once flexible. Another reason transparency is resisted is that it equalizes time. Information that emerges years later loses force. When exposure is immediate, response must also be immediate. Delay is a form of protection. Transparency shortens that window. It accelerates consequence. Power does not disappear under transparency, but it is reshaped. It becomes more constrained, more procedural, more defensive. For those accustomed to operating without challenge, this feels like attack. It is not. It is adjustment. The tension between power and transparency is not about truth versus lies. It is about comfort versus constraint. Transparency makes power uncomfortable because it requires alignment between authority and responsibility. It removes the option to act first and explain later. Exposure changes behavior because it reminds power that it is being watched, not watched with hostility, but with attention. Attention is the one resource power cannot control indefinitely. Once it exists, it demands response, and response demands coherence between action, explanation, and consequence. Distraction is one of the most effective tools against accountability because it doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like choice. People are not told to stop paying attention. Their attention is simply redirected. New stories replace old ones. Emotional headlines crowd out complex questions. Outrage cycles burn hot and fast, leaving little room for sustained focus. In that environment, accountability doesn't fail because people don't care. It fails because their care is constantly being pulled elsewhere. Public attention is finite. Systems understand this. They don't need to erase information. They only need to outlast interest. When focus moves on, pressure dissolves. Unanswered questions remain unanswered not because they were resolved, but because they were displaced. Distraction creates the illusion of progress without the substance of resolution. Accountability requires continuity. It depends on memory, follow-up, and insistence. Distraction breaks that chain. When attention resets, Responsibility resets with it. Statements made under scrutiny are forgotten. Commitments lose urgency. Timelines stretch. What was once a demand becomes a footnote. This is not accidental. It is structural. The public is often framed as impatient, emotional, or easily missiled. In reality, the issue is not intelligence but saturation. When people are flooded with information, discernment becomes harder. Distraction thrives in volume. The more content competes for attention, the easier it is for unresolved issues to disappear into noise. Accountability doesn't collapse under opposition. It collapses under overload. Refusing distraction is not about ignoring other events. It is about recognizing patterns of diversion. When focus shifts precisely at moments of pressure, that timing matters. When technical debates replace moral ones, that shift matters. When personality conflicts overshadow systemic questions, that framing matters. Accountability begins when people notice not just what is being shown, but what is no longer being discussed. Distraction often masquerades as engagement. People argue, react, and share, believing they are participating. But reaction without direction diffuses energy. It feels active while producing no sustained demand. Systems benefit from this kind of engagement because it burns attention without generating consequence. Refusing distraction means choosing depth over immediacy. Another form of distraction is complexity theater. Processes are emphasized over outcomes. Legal language replaces plain explanation. Procedural updates substitute for substantive answers. The public is kept informed without being informed. This creates the appearance of movement while preserving ambiguity. Accountability requires clarity, not just communication. Refusal of distraction also involves resisting false closure. Announcements, resignations, or partial disclosures can feel like endpoints. They are often treated as conclusions rather than steps. When people accept these moments as resolution, pressure eases prematurely. Accountability depends on asking what changes, not just what happens. Distraction thrives on emotional extremes. Outrage spikes and fades. Hope surges and dissipates. Both can interrupt sustained focus. Systems are comfortable managing peaks. They are less comfortable with steady, measured attention. Calm persistence is harder to deflect than anger. Refusing distraction means maintaining interest after emotion subsides. Public accountability is not driven by consensus. It is driven by continuity. People do not need to agree on interpretation to insist on transparency. They only need to agree that questions remain. Distraction fragments that agreement by scattering focus. When everyone is looking at something different, no one is holding the center. Media cycles play a role, but responsibility does not rest solely with institutions. Individuals participate in distraction when they chase novelty over follow-up, when they share headlines but not updates, when they engage with speculation instead of verified information. Refusing distraction requires discipline. It means valuing resolution more than stimulation. Accountability also depends on resisting personalization. Distraction often reframes systemic issues as individual failures or conflicts. This narrows the scope of responsibility and limits consequence. When attention is fixed on personalities, structures remain intact. Refusing distraction means keeping focus on processes, incentives, and patterns rather than isolated figures. Time is a critical factor. Distraction accelerates time perception. Everything feels urgent, which paradoxically reduces patience for long-term inquiry. Accountability operates on longer timelines. Investigations take time. Reforms take time. Refusing distraction means accepting that meaningful outcomes are rarely immediate. There is also social pressure to move on. Continued attention can be framed as obsession, negativity, or resistance to progress. This social signaling discourages persistence. Accountability often requires being out of sync with prevailing mood. Refusing distraction means tolerating discomfort and standing apart from momentum. The public's power lies less in volume than in focus. Millions of fleeting reactions are less effective than sustained attention from fewer people. Systems track intensity. but they respond to duration. When attention persists, responses must evolve, statements must be refined, actions must be taken. Refusing distraction extends the lifespan of scrutiny. Distraction can also be internal. Fatigue, cynicism, and helplessness pull attention away just as effectively as headlines. When people believe nothing will change, they disengage. This belief benefits systems regardless of its accuracy. Accountability begins when people stay engaged despite uncertainty about outcome. Refusing distraction does not require certainty. It requires commitment to the process of questioning. It means returning to unresolved issues even when they are no longer trending. It means measuring progress against promises rather than impressions. When the public maintains focus, accountability becomes unavoidable. Not because power suddenly becomes ethical, but because inattention is no longer an option. Sustained attention creates a record. A record invites comparison. Comparison demands explanation. Explanation limits denial. Accountability begins not with outrage, exposure, or even transparency, but with attention that refuses to be redirected before answers are given.